If you are into movement and into physical training, but you don't know how to go about it, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Guys, today we are going to be talking about hip impingement and hip flexor strains. So if you have any questions, go down into the comment section and leave some comments, start some discussions, and I will get involved as much as I can. So the reason we are talking about hip impingement today is because I work with a lot of dancers and they come to me with the same problems, the same complaints all the time, and this has led me to do some research on the issue. Number two, a lot of my source material from today comes from Dr. Aaron Horschig, who is a brilliant trainer and a very trusted source as far as I'm concerned. So if you haven't seen him, go check him out. Okay, so let's get right into it. So the first thing we need to address is the difference between a hip impingement and a hip flexor strain. Now they cause problems in the same area, and because of that they oftentimes cause confusion as to what's going on in that area. So let's start with a hip flexor strain, as it's muscular and relatively simple. You have some muscles that run across the anterior part of your hip here, the iliopsoas muscles, and they can get irritated or strained due to repetitive activity like lifting your leg. Anything to do with flexing the hip can cause those muscles to strain, and that will be a hip flexor strain. So that's a muscular condition, and so that's that. A hip impingement, on the other hand, also known as femoroacetabular impingement, which is short for FAI, is a different condition. And there are three main types of FAI, of hip impingement essentially. So as we all know, the femur and the hip is a ball and socket joint. So let's say this is your femur, this is your hip socket. You've got the ball of the femur, which moves around inside the hip socket. Now, as you go into deep flexion of the hip, there is a chance that the femur bone will come into contact with the hip socket. Now, this can cause irritation, and there are three types of irritation. So if you have an irritation or a bone spur on the femur side of the joint, that is called a cam impingement. If, on the other hand, the irritation comes from the actual edge of the hip socket, that is called a pincer impingement. Of course, the worst case scenario is you have a cam and a pincer, and then that's called a combined hip impingement. Those are obviously the worst and something you want to be obviously avoiding. Now, why does this stuff happen? Well, it is because of poor movement habits, poor movement patterns, and this repetitive lifestyle of below par quality movement will cause these injuries. Other times it can simply be from trying to do a movement too many times or a stretch too many times in the wrong way without having assessed the joint before. And then you have your impingements, your labrum tears, and all of that kind of nasty stuff, which we just don't need. So if you have this pain, you're probably asking yourself, well, Farid, how do I find out which it is, a strain or an impingement? So I'm going to show you how to do a few tests so you can figure out what it is that you're dealing with. So first of all, we're going to address the hip flexor strain. So usually you can test a muscle strain by either putting it under a stretch or putting it under a contraction, because the stretch obviously will demand the muscle fibers to move, and if there's an injury there, they'll be aggravated, and then you'll have your positive result. Alternatively, if you ask them to contract, that will also create a demand on the muscle, and then you'll get a sign of pain, usually, if it is positive. So a good way to go about this for the hip flexor is to do the old Thomas test. So in order to do the Thomas test, you're going to need an ever so slightly elevated surface. You can actually also do this on the floor, but for today I'm going to be using these bolsters. So the way this one works is you're going to lie yourself down on your elevated surface, and you're going to bring one knee up towards your chest. You should allow the open side of the hip to hang off, and if you feel a stretch or pain as this is happening, then you are positive. The other thing you can do is get someone, your friend or a weight, to push down on your leg, and you're going to try to lift that leg up against their resistance. And if it's positive and you get some pain or irritation, that'll be the test. You will know your muscles, quite likely your psoas muscles, are going to be irritated. Another quick way you can find out if it's a hip flexor strain as well is simply to sit down. So in my case, I will just take a seat on the bolsters, and whichever side it's on, I'm going to use my own hand here to push down on the leg, and I'm going to try to lift my leg up off the floor. Again, you are putting force through the muscle, so if it is a strain at the hip flexor, you should feel some pain as you try to do this. So just to recap, hip flexor strain, iliopsoas muscles that run across the front of the hip. If they are put under a stretch, that'll cause a positive result. And if they are put under a force, that will also cause a positive result if it is a hip flexor strain. Now, if you do these and you do not get a result, so it's negative, no pain, then it's not going to be a hip flexor strain, and we are going to move on to finding out whether it is a hip impingement. So usually a hip impingement will happen when the hip and femur are flexed, because you'll have that bone on bone contact potentially, and so that'll give you a positive result. So a simple way you can find out is to lower yourself down into your lowest flat foot squat, and if you experience any pain here at the bottom of this position, then it's likely to be an impingement. You can also here use your elbows to move your femur around the hip socket, and you can figure out what is going on. You can use your arm as well to create even more flexion here, and if you get pain, then you're likely dealing with either a pincer, a cam, or a combined impingement. Okay, so now that we've tested for impingement and hip flexor strain, let's go through different ways of tackling the problem. If it's a simple strain, there are two main things you're going to want to be doing. That is soft tissue release or massage and isometric contractions of the muscle. So for the first one, for soft tissue release, you're going to need to get yourself a ball like this one. It can be a lacrosse ball, or yeah, even a tennis ball can work. So yeah. All you'll need is a ball, and what's going to happen is you are going to lie yourself down on the floor on top of your ball, and you're going to be looking for that particular point that is causing you trouble, and then you're going to be rolling over it in an up and down fashion. So you might do, let's say, 8 up and down strokes, and then you are going to go side to side as well, cross laterally, and you can also do 8 of those. And you can repeat this a couple of times, and that will be your soft tissue work. Now, this promotes blood flow to the area and helps to ease out and break scar tissue, so the soft tissue stuff is a nice way to go. The other thing we're going to want to be doing is isometric contractions. So you're going to need to get yourself a resistance band. Now, once you have your resistance band, you are going to tie it around your feet, and you're going to lie yourself down on the floor. Make sure that there is no space between your lumbar and the floor, so your pelvis is in a posterior tilt. And let's say that the pain is in my right hip flexor. I'm going to keep my right femur flexed, and I'm simply going to pull down on the band using my left foot. And I'm going to hold this for 8 to 10 seconds and come back. And you are to repeat this for 3 sets. So 3 sets of 10-second isometric contractions. Play with different tension bands. This one is super light for me, so it's not really even scratching the surface, but there are different tensions that you can play with. Now, if you're dealing with an impingement, we need to start trying to get the femur to move around inside of that socket with a little bit more freedom, because it might be locked up in there, like we said, due to either poor movement patterns and habits throughout your life, or excessive sitting, excessive spending time in a single position, or just hammering the same movements over and over without paying attention to the quality of the motion. You're going to need an anchor point, and once again, you're going to need a band. And what we're trying to do here is mobilize the femur inside of the hip joint. So inside of that hip femur joint, there is a sleeve of tissue that covers the joint like a sock. Now, if that sleeve is very, very tight, and has not much motion, then your femur is basically going to be locked into moving in the same way due to that sleeve. So we want to be mobilizing that whole joint a little bit and using some traction here via the band. So here's how we're going to be doing that. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to find a band. We're going to loop our leg around it. Now this band is not ideal, but I will use it anyway for the demonstration purpose. You're going to loop the band around your femur and you're going to get a little bit of traction here on your femur. Now what you want to be doing is pushing the femur out, using that band as well to help. And then you want to be doing this actively by the use of the side of your bum muscles, the glute med. And then you want to be pulling the leg in. And if you use a resistance band that provides enough resistance, you should feel quite a nice feeling here at the hip, where your leg is being pulled inside of your hip socket. And again, pull out, lean into it a little bit, and then pull in. And you're going to repeat this 4 times, pushing out for 5 seconds, pushing in for 5 seconds. Repeat this 3 to 4 times and spend 30 seconds mobilizing your femur inside of the socket. Now, once you've done this, retest your squat, and it's likely to be a little less irritated. However, inside of a single session, you might not have the grandest results, but over the course of weeks and months of really mobilizing your joint, you should feel some positive results. Okay team, so let's recap what we've been talking about in this video. We have the difference between a hip flexor strain and a hip impingement. Hip flexor strain is muscular, and you can test this by putting your hip flexors either in a deep stretch or putting force through the muscle by trying to lift your knee up against a force. The Thomas test and the sit down test is a good way to figure out if you are positive there. And a hip impingement is simply a bone on bone contact. We've got 3 different types of hip impingements. We've got a cam, which is the femur side. We've got a pincer, which is on the hip side. And we've got a combined, which is both of those bones are irritated and perhaps causing bone spurs. And the test for this is just squatting down to your maximum range, because as you flex your hip, that's when you create the closest bone-on-bone contact. So if that's positive, it'll be a hip impingement. And now what have we done about both of those situations? If it's a strain and it's muscular, soft tissue with the ball, and then isometric holds, those are the 2 things you're going to want to do for a hip flexor strain. And for the impingement, you want to start mobilizing that fibrous sock that surrounds your joint in a posterior and lateral direction by using a heavy band to a solid anchor point. This setup I'm using is only for demonstration. You're going to need a way thicker band and a way more solid anchor point, and you're going to use that to start moving your femur inside of that ball and socket joint, and you're going to use your glutes as well to get some of that movement into the joint. Test, retest. It might be the case that this stuff will work for you immediately. It might also be the case that you'll have to bear with it for a couple of weeks, even months. So do not get discouraged. Keep doing the work. Stick to this routine. In either case, let me know what happens. That's all I have for you guys today. If you enjoyed it, jump down in the comments and let me know. And if you've gotten this far in the video and you like the content on the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out. Okay, I will see you on the next one.